Hello and welcome to another episode of Fundy Tidings. I'm your host Jay Remer, and with me today is Peter Corbyn. Welcome to the show, Peter.
Thank you.
Peter is the Executive Director of the New Brunswick Non-Profit Housing Association, and this is, when I found out about this, it really piqued my interest because it's such a necessary subject to discuss. And so, Peter, tell us about this association and what you're up to.
Thank you, what I'm up to. So the New Brunswick Non-Profit Housing Association has been around since 1992, so 32 years, and we represent about 170 nonprofit organizations that own and operate about 6,500 nonprofit housing units right across the province. So these would be the types of places where low-income seniors, low-income households, people formerly unhoused would live. Most of our members have been around since about the 1980s, so there's a substantial amount of public funding put towards housing from the late 70s to the early 1990s. So for the most part, almost all of our members' housing units are about 40 years old. So that roughly 6,500, again, these are owned and operated by nonprofit organizations with volunteer boards who, many of them have been at it for decades. Our units, or a number of units our members own, represents about 3.5% of all the housing stock in the province. And that is roughly the same percentage across the country as well. So roughly 3.5% of all housing stock in Canada is actually owned and operated by nonprofit housing organizations.
Interesting.
Yep.
Isn't that something? And so these organizations, the members are the organizations that own these different housing units.
Correct.
And so if it's been around since '82, you're doing something right.
We're providing affordable housing for thousands and thousands of individuals, well, in New Brunswick, but across the province. And one of the wonderful things about the nonprofit housing sector, or as we call it also community housing, which can include co-op housing, is that virtually all of our members can charge relatively low rent. So for example, you look at a lot of people that, especially seniors on a fixed income, can't afford, $1,500, $2,000 a month. So many of our members' rent, they may be in the $600-700 a month rent range.
Isn't that great? Well, I think the thing about being on a fixed income is that your income doesn't increase as fast as your expenses increase.
Sadly, correct.
Yeah. And I think that is, so you can go so far, and then, you can't go any further. And it's the thing about that is that it scares people. And we already are living in a culture of fear, but this just adds to it because it really speaks to our security. And if you don't have a roof over your head, that doesn't feel good. We're not wired for that.
I'll give you a perfect example of that. Well, we see it happening here in Charlotte County with what's happened in St. Steve in the last couple of years. But in Moncton especially, I'm sure a lot of that's been seen in the media as well. But I'll give you sort of an example of how that flow can happen. So we are all well aware that the population of the province has increased substantially in the last, let's say, 3 years anyway. I call that the New Brunswick population hockey stick. Roughly from 1987 to 2020, the population of New Brunswick grew by 50,000 in 32 years. So 50,000 in 32 years. The next 50,000 population happened in 3 years. Mm-hmm. So our population growth grew 10 times faster in the last 3 years, hence the hockey stick. And to put that in perspective, sort of community size-wise, from 1987 to 2020, 2021 range, we grew by roughly the population of St. Andrews, okay, provincially. Now we're growing by the population of a Bathurst or an Evanston every year. It may taper off a bit, but that population growth means that we're falling behind on providing housing for people. Yeah. In Moncton, I talked with a gentleman, his name is Mark Beliveau. He's a fantastic guy. He's the Executive Director of Harvest House, who provide housing and shelter for people at housing risk. And his list of people looking for housing is growing very quickly. And I asked him once about a year ago, I said, where do your clients come from? He said, well, we've seen this a lot in the province, what you call the financialization of the real estate market, right? So there's an apartment building anywhere in the province, and the tenants were paying $800, $900 a month for it. And then we've seen a lot of outside investors come into New Brunswick, purchase that building, put a coat of paint on it, and then they decide they're going to increase the rent from $800 a month to $1,200 a month. When you're paying $800 a month rent, and if you're, depending on what your income is, that $400 a month can make a big difference, to the point where 2 or 3 months go by, and guess what? You can't pay the rent, you're evicted, you're on the street.
Yeah.
Sad, but that's great to see our population grow, but the rate of change that's happening in the province is really having a dramatic impact on the quality of life. People either living, like you said, with a roof over their head or living outside.
Yeah, it's been, when you look at the numbers and you kind of connect the dots, it seems to me pretty clear that we're still in a, homelessness is growing rather than shrinking.
Correct.
And I actually even had the thought, which I hope never comes true, but you know how these tented villages have popped up. Even when I was speaking to a friend of mine from Halifax, he said, I left Halifax 2 years ago, there weren't any tented villages, and he says they're all over the place now. So this is indicative of a problem. Mm-hmm. And it's not, the current government is not in a position to really make much of a change for a variety of reasons, and we'll just leave it at that. But I see this, the thought that had crossed my mind is, one day people may be lucky to be living in a tent. I mean, that's how bad things are getting. You can't find, because there are not enough houses and for people to live in. And if the population is going to increase, it's going to just get worse.
Yes.
Anyway, I think so that's why I think this is such a fascinating topic, because the solution is so elusive. So why, can you explain why community housing is so important to low-income households?
So community housing, again, basically define that as nonprofit housing, public housing, and co-op housing, or cooperative housing. So like I said earlier, in Canada, roughly 3.5% of total housing stock is community housing or nonprofit based. In some European countries or OECD countries, it's upwards of 10 to 20%. And in Vienna, it's actually 60%. So the reality is there are a percentage of the population that need affordable housing, period. Mm-hmm. Okay. The challenge is, right now, if you look at the point in history right now, if you look at 2024, baby boomers are retiring en masse, right? Which includes all the skilled tradespeople, right? So everyone would complain, and rightfully so, we can't find plumbers or electricians or carpenters. Valid issue. But also, again, with the rapid population growth, that is displacing people. So we're not keeping up with demand for housing, especially affordable housing. Community housing is a provision of housing where the owner of the property, so we can go out and buy our own house, and that's great, and have a mortgage, and life is good. But again, there's a lot of people that rent. Right? Those that rent have a budget that says I can rent for so many dollars a month. If I'm a private developer or for-profit developer, and I build a building and people will come and live in it, if the rent's $1,500 or $2,000 or $2,500, good on you, right? Go ahead. But it's those people that, $1,000, $800, $900, that's all they can afford.
Yeah.
Really, the only solution for that is community housing. It's as simple as that. Where the landlords, are not motivated by profit at the end of the day. They've got to break even and make a little bit, but at the end of the day, they are providing shelter. A basic human right is shelter, right? So there is an economic argument, and studies have been done to demonstrate this, that providing appropriate shelter is, if you look at let's take someone that's living in a tent or on the street right now. There was a study done about 10, 12 years ago in Canada, so it's Canadian context, that basically demonstrated that the cost to a taxpayer, now this is in 2011 dollars, so you can probably take inflation into account. The cost to a taxpayer to look after someone living on the street is about $55,000 a year.
Really?
Yes. Now that is in 2011 dollars. You can probably take that to $70,000 or $75,000 now, right? So that takes into account policing, healthcare, social development, law enforcement, you name it. So now that said, that's coming from multiple government departments, whether they're municipal, federal, or provincial. So picture that again in 2011 dollars, $55,000 to look after someone that is on the street, right? Like I said, probably $70,000 to $75,000 now. So if housing is provided, even if it costs $1,500 a month all in, that's what, $18,000 a year. So that's probably a third or a quarter of the cost to look after someone living on the street. Mm-hmm. Now that's just from a pure economic perspective. But the other thing that I will share that has had a dramatic impact on me and my commitment to what I do in this position and promoting nonprofit housing. About a year and a half ago, I was in Moncton, and some of your viewers may have heard of an organization called Rising Tide.
Oh, yes.
Or 12 Neighbors in Fredericton. Very similar, kind of different way to getting to what they're doing, but 12 Neighbors with Marcel Lebrun in Fredericton, who's gone on to build 96 tiny homes now, was able to seed that project with his own resources because he did well with an exit with an IT company a decade or so ago. So I applaud Marcel for what he's done. Rising Tide, similar purpose, but funding was raised in a different way. So their board managed to raise $15 million from the municipal, provincial, and federal governments, and basically entered into a 3-year development agreement with the city of Moncton to build about 160 units, mostly for formerly unhoused individuals or people leaving domestic violence. The reason I provide that sort of information is I've been involved substantially with Rising Tide and getting some of their projects built. But about a year and a half ago, I was in a building in Moncton that Rising Tide now owns. It's 21 apartments, so 3 floors, 7 apartments per floor. And these apartments are basically like oversized hotel rooms. They're like a hotel room with a kitchenette, size-wise. And I left this building, and there was a young lady sitting on the doorstep. And I said, "Do you live here?" She said, "Yeah." She didn't know me from Adam. And she told me she'd been living there for 2 or 3 months, and she said, "This place has changed my life." And I've got a place to live. I've got a sense of community and that kind of thing. And after the conversation, I went whoosh through my body. And it occurred to me, I had a conversation with her because I knew that she had a place to live. How many of us in big cities, or even perhaps in St. Stephen, will walk by someone and not make eye contact or not just connect with the person because they're on the street, right? And that just struck me. And earlier this year, I did an interview with a young lady in Fredericton who had lived on the street for a year, and she lived in a tent. And we talked for an hour and a half, then recorded part of the conversation. And we were making eye contact like you and I are right now. And when we were done taping the conversation, I said, "We're making eye contact." He said, "Yes, we are." And I asked her, I said, "When you were on the street, did anyone ever make eye contact with you?" She said, "Nope." No. And she was housed. So just that, these people are individuals, they're human beings. They have a basic human right to live in a home that's heated and running water and all that stuff. So
it's really interesting what you've just said, because it indicates to me, anyway, because from where my perspective is, the need for connection. It's that simple. People need to connect with other people. I mean, you know perfectly well that no man is an island and you can't do everything by yourself and all this kind of thing. But we often are not in that position of not having connection. Like, we have connection with, you and I are probably very lucky. These people who are living on the street are not so lucky. And when you lose connection, you lose sense of self and
100%,
purpose.
100%.
So answering the question of the importance of community housing for low-income people is it gives them a sense of community, and they can connect with other people. Now, I do have one economic question.
Yes.
And that is, when I was growing up and having to get my own place, the rule of thumb was you would allocate a third of your income to your housing, whether it was
Correct.
rent or mortgage or whatever it might be. Is that still the same? And if that is the case, what is the poverty level is like around $25,000 a year or something like that. What can someone who is in low income, what can they actually afford?
So that third is actually still true. So generally, not generally, but the definition of affordable housing would be that someone is spending no more than 30% of their gross income on housing. So that said, you could take someone making $1 million a year, right, or 80, whatever the math works out to. But if they've got a mortgage payment of, I don't know, $100,000 a month, that's still affordable to them, right?
Right.
But if you look at someone that's grossing $1,000 a month, or say $2,000 a month, to your point, $24,000 a year, so that $2,000 a month, 30% of that is
$700.
Thank you. Exactly. Yeah. So that is where the reality is today. Net new units cannot be built to be able to rent for $700 a month. It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. So that's where contributions through the federal government, through CMHC, Housing NB, the provincial government, and even funding that's come from the federal government to municipalities, the Housing Accelerator Fund, are all helping contribute capital to that housing, so that the capital costs can come down, so that people that can afford just that amount can actually live in a decent place.
So that is assuming then that the government has some responsibility to top up the coffers for people who don't make enough?
Correct.
Right.
Yep.
So that's a good goal for the government to have.
Yes. Now, to your point, sorry about the income. Now, one of the challenges we have here in New Brunswick is whether it's minimum wage or basic wages and salaries have not been climbing at the same rate as housing has.
Right.
Right. So I remember my first apartment when I left university. I paid for a 2-bedroom apartment. I paid $300 a month, and that was a nice place, right? You can't rent a broom closet for that today.
Right.
Now that said, I was thinking about this just this morning. In the last 43, 44 years, minimum wage has increased 5 times. Like my first job down the street, I think was $3 an hour. Minimum wage is now 15. But if you look at the price of housing has shot up, especially in the last 3 years, at a much greater rate than, like to your point earlier, with 30%.
Yeah.
That difference is just becoming much more difficult.
Yeah, that's where I see the big challenge.
Yep.
Now, another interesting question here is the concept of desirability to have community housing in your neighborhood. So I love the word YIMBYism because it's usually NIMBYism, and I thought that's a very fascinating. So how do you convince people that this is actually a good thing for their community?
Well, so NIMBYism is short for not in my backyard.
Right.
YIMBY is short for yes in my backyard. So I'll give you a perfect example. I guess that this comes back to a rising tide in Moncton, but also I think as a great example of why we need to, in communities the size of St. Andrews, St. Stephen, Moncton, even Toronto or London, we need to start thinking YIMBYism or yes in my backyard. So an example in Moncton, so Rising Tide, I think it was their second project about 3 years ago. They purchased an older Victorian house near downtown Moncton, and this house had a really bad reputation. Things were going on in there that shouldn't be going on, right? You can use your imagination on that. And so Rising Tide, at the time, a brand new nonprofit, no one knew who they were just this new nonprofit housing organization, bought this old Victorian house. They renovated it, and it's now a rooming house for 7 individuals who, again, were formerly unhoused. In that immediate vicinity, a group of people got together and said, not in my backyard. So it was led by a couple that lived about 3 or 4 doors down on the other side of the street. And they wrote a really nasty letter to Dale Hicks, the founding chair of Rising Tide, and said, not in our backyard. This place is, there's drug deals going on, there's prostitution, et cetera, et cetera. And now a nonprofit wants to buy it. Not in our backyard. So Rising Tide took this building, renovated it. 7 individuals living in there now. I've been through this place, beautiful, nice house. A few months after it got cleaned up and people are living in there, the people leading the not in my backyard wrote another letter to Dale and said, this is the best thing that's happened to our neighborhood.
Isn't that wonderful?
And for a couple of reasons. And this can be quantified because they actually have records of, for example, police calls and emergency calls to the particular, to that property. The number of police calls and emergency calls to that property went down year over year. 97% went down. Mm-hmm. Not only that, but they also got an award from the city of Moncton for, bringing for helping out with actually creating a better heritage house. So taking an old Victorian home and bringing it back to life.
Right.
One of the things I think is really important with providing affordable housing, especially for people who were formerly unhoused, is not to put them all in the same place, to disperse them throughout the community, to be inclusive. So don't, if you're providing housing for 50 people now, 12 neighbors is a slightly different model because they've got one piece of land that's right beside a Walmart and a Kent and all that. But typically, advocates will say, put 4 people here, or 4 units there, 4 units here, because if you get too many in one place, then you get that, don't go over there, right? Mm-hmm. But if you've got, a 4 unit here and a 4 unit here and a 4 unit there, then you don't have that, place for congregation. Mm-hmm. I ran into a similar thing in Moncton. I designed a building in Moncton for 16 people that were formerly unhoused. And we got that too. I had to go before council and say, look, this is going to help. And people who live next door are going to be like, yeah, right. But the building that was on in this particular case, the building that was on the property beforehand, again, similar to the old Victorian, people were living in there that shouldn't have been there. It was a fire hazard, et cetera, et cetera. We put up a nice brand new building. And the place it looks great. There's been no issues. In fact, one of the gentlemen that lives in this building, and I joke, the 16 units, there's 8 on the first floor and 8 on the second floor. Again, they're basically oversized motel rooms with a kitchenette. A gentleman, Jamie Wilson, who lives, I jokingly call it the penthouse because it's on the top floor and with the most windows. So Jamie, I interviewed him earlier this year, and Jamie is 50 years old. He has spent 23 of his 50 years, almost half his life in jail. He knew no better even when he started out in life. He now has a roof over his head, and he's now working as a peer supporter as well. So providing housing for this gentleman is actually, and he said to me in this interview, he said, my life now has purpose because I'm housed.
Yeah. It's amazing how important feeling safe is. And I don't think it's not appreciated enough. I spend a lot of time writing about this stuff, so for me, I'm sort of consumed by it. But I also am convinced that connecting with other people and like having 4 units here and 4 units there removes the stigma too. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's important because we need to be nicer as a society.
Yes.
And so that would lead to my final question, and we have about 3 minutes.
Okay.
Is how can we help you and be part of the this community effort?
So, as I stated earlier, nonprofit organizations have board of directors. So if you take just in New Brunswick alone, so of our 170 members, on average, we'd have 4, 5, 6, 7 board members per organization. Roughly, that's about 1,000 individuals who are volunteer board members. A very high percentage of those volunteer board members have been involved since the 1980s. So picture in the 1980s, you're in your 30s, and now it's the 2020s, and now you're in your 70s, right?
Right.
So we recently surveyed our members at our annual conference, and of our board members, 63% of our board members are 60 and over. 26% of our board members are in their 70s, and 6% of our board members are in their 80s. Roughly 40% of those board members around the province plan on retiring from their boards in the next 1 to 3 years. So that means roughly 400 individuals who volunteered years, if not decades of their life in providing community housing are ready to retire and walk away, and they deserve that. So one of the activities that we're doing as an association is to get word out through interviews like this, to raise the awareness about the community housing sector, but also to, quite frankly, recruit new voluntary board members. So let people know we exist as a sector, but also to say, hey, you know what? If you are concerned about housing, you'd like to get involved in housing, we have a role for you, depending on the location, if you're part of the community. These nonprofit organizations would more than welcome having new board members join them.
So how do we connect with you or your group to find out what the next step might be? Is there a website, for instance?
Our website, it's nbnonprofithousing.ca. I think, isn't that awful? I don't even know our own website.
That's okay, but there is a website.
They can Google New Brunswick Non-Profit Housing Association.
Right.
And or me. I'm on LinkedIn and Facebook and such.
Yes.
But please contact me. And we've actually had about 7 or 8 people that have reached out to me already and said, look, I'd like to engage. So just Google New Brunswick Non-Profit Housing Association and contact myself, Peter Corbyn, and happy to have a conversation with them.
Wonderful. Peter, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank
this
you.
has been really enlightening and very helpful, and I'm so excited for you and
Thank you.
Very proud of the work you're doing.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching the show today, and I look forward to seeing you on another episode of Fundy Tidings.